John 5:13. Is autem qui sanus fuerat effectus, nesciebat quis esset Iesus, enim declinavit turba constituta in loco. But he who had been made well did not know, was not aware who Jesus was, for he, that is Jesus, turned aside from, or slipped away from, we might say, the crowd which was gathered in that place. There are a couple of interesting constructions worth commenting on here. So we've just had the Jewish leaders asking closely this man who is healed, what were the circumstances of the healing, and of course, most importantly, who was it who accomplished this healing? But the man doesn't know. He doesn't know the identity of Jesus, and he doesn't know his name, so he's sort of at a loss to reply. We get a really paraphrastic expression here. Is autem, but, or moreover, he who had been made well. And let me just walk you through this part by part here. Effectus is the fourth principal part from efficio, which itself is a development of the word facio, which you know, of course, to do or to make, etc. Efficio here in combination with this form of esse makes a compound verb, which means had been made something. In a different context, we might say had been done, had been produced, something like that. But here we've got sanus, indicating that this man had been put into a different state, a state of wellness in this case. He wasn't well, and now he is because of the healing that Jesus effected. He, however, who had been made well, had been made healthy, he's the subject also of nesciebat. He was not aware. He wasn't sure. He didn't know at that time who Jesus was. And what's really important to note about nesciebat here is that it introduces an indirect question. An indirect question is simply a question that is reported or embedded in someone's thought or speech in sort of a secondary way. That is, we're not getting the direct question, which would simply be, quis est Iesus? Who is Jesus? That question is embedded in a larger structure. That's really all that's meant by this grammatical term, indirect question. It can be something somebody says, something they think or perceive or know, etc. All kinds of verbs, not just nesciebat, can introduce such clauses. But the main thing that we need to remember for our purposes as Latin learners is that when an indirect question occurs, we're going to find a verb in the subjunctive. And in fact, if you're composing a sentence like this, you have to use a verb in the subjunctive in that subordinate clause. Now, the tense that you're going to use for that verb in the subjunctive clause, remember, it's going to be relative to the tense of the verb of the main clause. Here we've got an imperfect active indicative, nesciebat, literally he was not knowing who Jesus was. And when we use an imperfect subjunctive, which is what we have here in esset, it's indicating that the action portrayed in this question was happening at the same time as or subsequent to the action of that main verb in nesciebat. So let's say we're talking about yesterday. Yesterday, this man was not knowing who Jesus was at that same time that he was not knowing. So we're talking about the past here because remember, this is all after the healing has happened. But another way of putting this is that esset is contemporaneous with nesciebat. And occasionally the imperfect subjunctive in indirect questions like this in the sequence of tenses, not just indirect questions, but subordinate clauses in the subjunctive, it can indicate time subsequent to the time of the main verb occasionally as well. But very often this is what we find. It's indicating contemporaneous time. So the tense of the subjunctive in the subordinate clause matters in relative relationship to the tense of the main clause. We never ought to forget that. And again, this is called the consecutio Temporum in Latin, in English, the sequence of tenses. And if that whole concept is fuzzy to you or unfamiliar, it's worth going back in your reference grammar of choice and reviewing the rules for how the sequence of tenses and subordinate clauses with the subjunctive works. For the purposes of this verse, we can move on to this interesting expression, declinavit turba constituta in loco. This is worth commenting on for a couple reasons. One is the sense of this word, declino, declinare. And this verb, which perhaps you've not seen very often, means something like to turn aside, to turn away from. In this context, something even like to slip away, that is sort of to depart or move away inconspicuously, we might say. And that helps us explain these ablatives we've got here with turba and constituta. We might have had an a or ab here before turba constituta, and in fact, some manuscripts of the Vulgate do include an a or ab here, just to make the sense perfectly clear, but we don't technically need it. This is probably an ablative of separation. That is, he slipped away or turned aside from or moved away from the crowd that had been gathered in that place. Where constituta as a perfect passive participle is modifying just in an easy adjectival way this noun turba, crowd or large gathering, and declinavit, that de at the beginning, is exercising some of its ablative separative force on this noun turba. He turned away from the crowd that had gathered or that had been gathered in that place.